One cedar blade disturbs the lake's sleep. The woman's companion desperately alternates between rowing and attempting to play surgeon. Returning to the bench beside her, he tears cloth and applies pressure to the wound under the soaked wool. His knot is nearly arranged when she moans to center her strength and seizes with her entire body. Blood surges through frigid fingers with no regard to their dressing, and the man abandons the cloth to cover the puncture with his palms. 2 hands are not enough. He quickly loses his pale knuckles in a tidal crimson pool and opts to hold her wrenched torso close to his chest in a tender embrace instead. As the waves gently lapped at the shore, the tranquility of the scene is suddenly disrupted by the shrill cries of a newborn. A figure emerges from inspecting some evidence of the boat launch, rifle in hand, and gazing out into the murky night as if searching for someone in the dark. Carelessly, the figure stumbles into the water. His mouth falls open in disbelief, and the rifle barrel nearly droops to meet the waves. White whips of surf lash up toward the mounted midnight metal.
Chapter 2. Grand Designs.
Beneath the dock, the barrels are now bound to the beams beside the Serenity. A single fuse is daisy-chained around the wet wood. On board, Caroline dozes sweetly upon Thomas's chest. Thomas gazes intently at the majestic moon rising out the small round window, lost in his thoughts. Thomas recalls the conversations from the pub he visited the previous night in the port of Montreal. Several inebriated men, French trappers who talked like patriots, had confided in him about their plan to kidnap the governor's daughters. Rebels schemed to sacrifice one daughter to demonstrate their commitment to their cause, trading the other for a hefty ransom in silver and releasing the third upon the British evacuation of the island. Thomas listened with trepidation and thought it wise to conceal his budding relationship with the influential family occupying the fort. Instead, Thomas had pandered along like a fellow rebel, attempting to discourage the drunkards most of the night. Initially, Thomas had dismissed the drunken plot of fools, but now the agenda was laced with opportunity for him and his love as it echoed in his mind, drowning out the waves. Should Caroline be the daughter to be held to manipulate her father, of which Thomas would make sure, the two could slip away from the disorganized rebels and start a life together. Caroline moans sweetly as the boat settles abruptly against the bottom and turns into the trapper's arms.
"I need you to listen,"
says Thomas. Caroline looks up, alert from the tone in her lover's voice.
"What would you give to stay?"
He asks intently. The boy's questions seem to oppose his nature. She pushes up to better see his expression.
"What I mean is, if you could never see your family again, what if you could never return to Libster?"
He studies her face for alarm before continuing.
"And we could go."
Yes.
"Are you certain? You need not know where we would go or how we would live."
He sits up to ask. Caroline dives into his chest to answer, but he takes her by the shoulders.
"No, my dove. I need you to tell me that you are certain, at all costs, that you and I together would be enough."
"I am certain that my life began with you here," she says, and the two settle back into their nest. Moonbeams flash as the boat rocks.
"In that case, you need to retire as routinely as we can still manage tonight."
He urged.
"To succeed, we must rely on your father's duty to schedule. We have to appear compliant, and, unfortunately, the less you know, the better."
Mindlessly ignoring the risk accompanying his intent, Thomas nods slightly to bolster Caroline's confidence. She grumbles but rises to collect her corset and then her braids. Their return to the dock is unsteady, pouring at one another as neither is genuinely willing to sacrifice their embrace and willing to do anything for a future together. At the ramp edge, he kisses her softly and whispers,
"Do not fear,
and
I love you."
Caroline drifts out into the dark of the night, her silhouette gradually becoming smaller and smaller. Two shadows recede into the distance beyond the edge of the dock, but Thomas averts his gaze, pretending not to notice. The moon, partially obscured by clouds as soft as satin, casts a dim light over the deserted straits. As Caroline disappears, the world around Thomas seems to fade away, leaving only the lingering scent of gunpowder in the desolate docks.
Nearly a century and a half later. Sparks splinter to the gravel beach, scarring blades of grass on their way to the chamber of a small cannon. Floop. A mortar comes to life beneath the night sky, trailing up and out over the lake. Jimmy lays in a deck chair on red planks illuminated by the magnesium burn in the distance. When the sound of the explosion echoes around the seductive garden surrounding a grand hill, he does not blink, but casually drags a cigarette. Behind him, guests arrive at a grand hotel by way of horse-drawn carriages, but Jimmy remains isolated from the day's work. Nearly a city block down on the Titanic porch, people from the porches above krill over the display, and Jimmy rolls his eyes.
Effing tourists.
His foot taps along to their jazz orchestra while smoke casually slips from his nostrils. The conservatory door opens, and the curtain creates a theatrical scene to silhouette Carlotta sauntering through in a slithering beaded gown. Her dark hair gets lost in its shadow, but not before briefly matting her red lips and pale skin. Once out of the light, far out of sight of the politicians, Carlotta hopes to entertain for the night. She gathers a joint from her glove and approaches Jimmy at his corner of the hotel's porch. As Jimmy welcomes her, she sits to a striking match and a jacket around her bare shoulders. Red embers in the sky beyond seem to fall and land between her lips on the cherry as she inhales. She savors the draw sensation before catching a cough, then drifts away as the buzz settles behind her green eyes. Placing 3 white fingers on Jimmy's chin, she passes the smoke across her lips past Jimmy's. Carlotta settles onto Jimmy's inflated chest. She stares restlessly into the dark as he exhales over her satin strands. Her hand clings to Jimmy's side as he tosses his hat and folds his hands behind his head. In the tiny city, Sheriff Sinclair paces alone at the station, unusually casual for the explosions bombarding the window through the cell. Facing east, he concludes his march by checking the clock in the hall. While facing west, he can glance at the timepiece on his desk, open and ticking. Crippled by the clock, he would never want to seem anxious to a passerby or else seem weak, and so he masked his anxiety by appearing dutiful while knowing his authority was currently superseded by the criminal elements in town. Up the hill, a drunkard mouths off to the malt shop's owner in protest of being dismissed for the evening by the dozens of girls eating ice cream at 10 p.m. Sinclair hangs his head as the scene plays out between blasts, everything amplified by the vacant cell. Loudest are the silent moments as the cannons reload. Taunted, the sheriff can feel the beat of his father's watch in these moments and reels every time it is interrupted. Tommy strolls through the hall, his wingtips rhythm opposing the watch, and Sinclair gives the brass to the drawer and then takes a seat. Surprised, Tommy mockingly puts his driving gloves up, one in each hand, and waves as if to surrender.
Easy there, Patty.
Feigning composure, Sinclair sits far back in his chair and laces his fingers across the buttons of his vest. Tommy proceeds to make his entrance and sits across from the sheriff in the open cell. He takes a flask from his jacket and slugs away in defiance before offering it to the lawman. The stalemate develops as the criminal blatantly disrespects the officer in his own house, sporting a sly, cheeky grin. Receiving only a vacant stare, Tommy shrugs and exchanges the flask for a manila parcel. As he exits, he pats the sheriff on the shoulder with the envelope, which the sheriff allows to fall into his lap rather than reach to receive it.
Whatever. Happy 4th. See you for armistice. Try not to enjoy it, eh?
Tommy tips his hat, and he's gone. When the boy has left, Sinclair smiles and then laughs, reminded of his lads. Closing his eyes, he mutters a prayer for the boy and his path to humility. Then, begrudgingly, he tosses the hush money into the same drawer as the watch, which is carefully locked as Sinclair shuts the station down. At their home on the hill beside the fort, 2 yellow stars are in the first-story window to honor the Sinclair boys who fought and died in the Great World War. Miranda waits in the rocking chair before a grand harbor-facing window, but not for the sheriff. Pictures of her boys stand sentinel as their father crosses the threshold. He hangs his hat and time key before kissing his wife's head. With no reaction from her, he holds her hand for several moments before solemnly walking deeper into the lonely house. From across the street, Tommy peers through the window, his hat's brim casting a shadow over his face. With a determined expression, he watches as Sinclair returns and places a glass of water beside his wife, before climbing the stairs near the front door to retire. Tommy emerges from the darkness and steps into the dimly lit path to reveal himself, casting a faint shadow behind him. As he approaches the woman, her face remains stoic and unreadable, and her eyes wander into the darkness beyond. Tommy takes one last look at the woman before turning his back to her and descending the hill, his silhouette slowly fading into the shadows of the historic fort.
18 is old enough for summer jobs on Mackinac. Today, James paints the corners of the Grand White Hotel, suspended from the upper balcony aboard precarious scaffolding as the SS Siren returns from the mainland ferry run in the straits below. He gets distracted by every dark-haired girl on a bike or carriage, mistaking them momentarily for Carly, and thinks of their morning on the boat's deck. Despite the beautiful landscape over his left shoulder, he navigates the harbor side of the hotel pillar by pillar through his staggered work and fruitless hobby. At the end of the workday, James stands over his rigging and rope, ignoring the afternoon's accomplishments stretching out behind him, and looks down the hill toward town while still longing for a glimpse of Carly. Eventually, he gives up and carts down the mountain himself. As he leaves, Carly arrives on a bright new purple cruiser, crossing onto the hotel's main drive just feet from where James had been waiting. In town, Billy was waiting at the popular eatery on the island, a malt shop turned teen club called Millie's that also sold overpriced beer. Billy liked to do his drinking on the mainland, the beers were half-priced after 3, and his mom lived a block away. Families were dining on the island when the two friends clocked out. 3 hot dogs and 6 milkshakes stood between the counter bar and the jukebox, which had worn out the Kingston Trio 3 spins ago. Clack, scratch, skiff, hush, hiss. Frank Sinatra chimed in coolly from an illustrious case of blown glass. Billy mouthed to himself, "I got the world on a string," along with a record, and tried to enjoy his beer. James rings the bells on the door twice in a sturdy fashion, once as he opens the rig for himself, then again against the wall when he awkwardly dances to hold it for a family of 3. No one says thank you, but he doesn't notice as he is genuinely delighted to have a purpose. Billy waves to his friend, and James nods back. Winking at the waitress, Billy points to James. She nods and arrives with the beer before James can settle. Billy gives her a go-ahead nod while his friend is distracted, and the girl smiles with a wink.
"So who's the new guy?"
Donna asks with a hand moving up to touch James on his arm. Donna's affection petrifies James. Billy gives the younger boy a queer eye but then absorbs the awkwardness when he starts boasting.
Tell her like she doesn't already know there, James.
Billy elbows James with a wink, who blushes slightly, knowing exactly what's happening next.
Tell her like I didn't tell this whole damn island about the tulip. Jimmy T. Big Dick.
"Billy!"
Donna says, putting a stop to their game. James is hiding his face but grinning with appreciation, accustomed to his friend's focused and often obnoxious bolstering to counter his timid personality. Summers bunking together at a juvenile camp for boys would have been a nightmare had James not been adopted by the older boy he now considered to be the older brother he lacked. Families and couples dining amongst the malt shop crowd are less than amused at the tables behind them, several sneering as James sips his beverage at the counter. Billy turns to wave at everyone, letting his denim knees fall apart with disregard, and Donna walks away, shaking her head.
So where is Lou bunking you?
Billy asks, his voice suddenly with a sincere tone reserved solely for James. Secluding into the letters on the bottle, James mutters.
Some cottage in a village.
The village. Shit, so up the hill with the trash.
Jimmy shrugs.
So do I take a bus? Or what?
No buses, a horse-drawn taxi. You can. If you marry well, I suppose. And stare at 3 horses' asses for 20 minutes every night for $2. No, it's not another town, it's where all the staff lives. The barns, horse shit, and everything the tourists don't want to see. Be up there for reefer now and again.
Billy casually remarks.
Come on, drink your beer, and I'll take you up there.
1 beer. James doesn't think he could have heard his friend correct and looks to see that the inside of Billy's coat is lined with bottles of American steam lager. With everything making more sense, James takes a long drink as Billy stands. Billy thumbs out several bills from a roll of cash. Trying to keep up, James forces another drink but pushes the beer away when he spits it back up. Donna turns at the sound, and Billy winks, throwing out another few bills before they leave. As they step outside, the duo gathers their bikes, with Billy apologizing to James for one more stop he has to make. Curiosity piques James' mind as he follows Billy blindly down to the docks. To his surprise, Billy quickly lifts countless suitcases onto the front of his bike. James watches in amazement as Billy maneuvers his bike around the obstacles and leads him back up the hill behind the hotel. The weight of the load seems enormous, and its bulk is a visual reminder of the challenge ahead. Despite this, Billy pushes forward, determined to reach their destination. As the two laborers ascend the hill beside the Grand Hotel, the same one James had spent the day painting, the gap between him and Billy quickly grows more exhaustive, but James is so engrossed in the houses around him that he fails to notice. He searches every cottage and home for the black-haired girl.
That's Lou's cabin spot.
Billy yells back and points at the corner to a bungalow called a cottage as he stops in the road. Once James catches up, Billy says,
I got to go back more and visit this professor's place. It's a cool gig, I've never been up there. The professor, this guy Tom, is known as the town nut. Most of the island was entrusted to him years ago, so everyone has work that goes through him, but he never leaves that house except to teach a history class at the college. All the kids I've ever talked to said he was a spook to study for. He is probably the richest man in the Great Lakes, and no one ever sees him enjoying himself. Want to come along and see what it's about?
James nods, and Billy turns them down a trail marked Cupid's Path. As Billy turns to go around some horseshit in the road, the top of his load slips from its perch. Fascinated by the grace with which Billy's hand found the handle and folded a trapeze act neatly into his maneuver, James couldn't help but run the same pile over directly with both tires. Emerging from the trees, the trail leads to a road behind the fort. Casually cruising, James notices the massive fallen oak tree near the rear corner of the white stone walls. James sees beauty in the fallen stones left scattered like stars in the lush green grass to commemorate the tree's life. The boys round the bend onto the bluff where, down below, the sun bounces from red roofs on the Mission College and carries several gulls to a cloudless sky. Billy parks beside a Victorian cottage and ignores its forbidding gate. James stays with the bikes.
Come on.
Calls Billy.
Grab those grips.
James retrieves a duffel bag and a typewriter and proceeds up the path. Knock, 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 knock. The door opens, and as the wind fades, the sound of a harbor buoy reaches James.
Are you the professor?
Billy asks skeptically. Not quite, a sweet girl's voice replies. James turns, and Carly stands, drying her hair in the doorway. Blinking at the girl stands a gesture of James for a smirking Billy, who allows his friend to fall pale before the blushing Carly.
Hi.
Billy says calmly and coolly.